On the afternoon of February 7, 1944, on a strip of sand south of Rome, the place that was supposed to be the safest spot on the entire battlefield was a cluster of tents with enormous red crosses painted on their roofs. By 2:30 that day, it would be the deadliest place on it. This was Anzio. On January 22nd, Allied forces had stormed ashore in Operation Shingle, hoping to outflank the German lines blocking the road to Rome and force a breakthrough toward the capital. British troops landed north of the town, American troops to the south, and a force of U.S. Rangers seized the port itself. The landing caught the Germans off guard. By the end of the first day, tens of thousands of Allied troops were ashore against only light resistance, and for a moment the road north lay open. The Allied command paused to consolidate its position. The Germans did not waste the gift. Within days, the beachhead had hardened into a strip of ground roughly 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide, ringed by hills the Germans now held, hills from which their artillery could reach almost every square yard of it. Winston Churchill, who had pushed hard for the operation, summed up the result in a single line that became famous. He had hoped, he said, to hurl a wildcat onto the shore. Instead, all the Allies had was a stranded whale. At Anzio, there was no rear area. The front line ran through everything, including the hospitals. 4 of them sat near the town of Nettuno, the 33rd Field Hospital and the 56th, 93rd, and 95th Evacuation Hospitals, all crowded onto open ground, close enough to the water that there was simply nowhere else to put them. Around 200 members of the Army Nurse Corps worked inside those canvas wards, closer to a front line than American military nurses had ever been sent before, and well within range of the German guns on the hills above. They adapted fast because they had to. When the air raid sirens wailed, they dropped into slit trenches half full of water and stayed down until it passed. Duck and crawl the nurses, themselves nicknamed the Anzio Shuffle. They slept in their helmets and not always in a cot. They operated in them too, when shelling started mid-surgery. At one point, the U.S. Fifth Army's command floated the idea of pulling the nurses off the beachhead altogether, for their own safety. The nurses pushed back harder than the Army had pushed for the idea in the first place. They stayed with their patients, and the Army let the matter drop. In between the alerts, the work went on in its strange, stubborn rhythm: rounds, dressings, plasma, surgery, and, when a supply convoy made it through, mail call. On the morning of February 7, after weeks with almost no word from home, letters finally reached the nurses and surgeons of the 95th Evacuation Hospital. For a few hours, it looked like any other day on the beachhead. It would not stay that way, and the warning signs were already there. The 95th itself had landed in Italy on September 9, 1943, the first U.S. Army hospital established on the European continent in the war, and its people already knew what marked meant to the Luftwaffe. Months earlier, off Salerno, the hospital ship Amache Newfoundland, lit and painted with red crosses exactly as the laws of war required, had been bombed with heavy loss of medical staff. Then, on the night of January 24, 1944, just 2 weeks before, 3 British hospital ships evacuating Anzio's wounded, HMS St. David, HMS St. Andrew, and HMS Leinster, were attacked together by Luftwaffe aircraft, despite all 3 being lit and marked the same way. The St. David took a direct hit and went down fast. Of the 226 medical staff and patients aboard, roughly 130 were pulled alive from the water by the damaged Leinster, among them 2 American Army nurses. One of them, Second Lieutenant Ruth Hindman, had survived the Newfoundland attack months before and now survived this one too. 2 marked ships sunk or savaged in less than half a year, and a 3rd hospital ship damaged alongside them that same night. The lesson was plain, even if no one wanted to believe it. At Anzio, the Red Cross was as much a target marking as a protection. Nothing in the experience of the Army Nurse Corps, up to that point, had prepared anyone for a posting like this. Nurses had served close to the fighting before, in North Africa, then at Sicily and Salerno, but Anzio put roughly 200 of them inside a beachhead so small and so static that close to the front simply meant on it for months at a stretch, with no way to rotate them out of range. The Army's own planners had not designed for this. The campaign did. Even before February 7, the hospitals at Nettuno were running at a few stateside surgeons could imagine. Surgical teams attached from the 2nd Auxiliary Surgical Group worked around the clock, alongside the evacuation hospital's own staff. One team alone handled more than 200 operations in 11 days during the heaviest fighting, and another performed well over 100 operations in a single 24-hour stretch. This was the rhythm the nurses of the 95th Evacuation Hospital had settled into. Relentless, exhausting, and on February 7th, about to be interrupted in the worst possible way. What happened just after 2:30 on the afternoon of February 7th made the earlier lesson impossible to ignore. A German aircraft, sent to bomb the harbor at Anzio, was intercepted by a British Spitfire. Climbing hard to break away, the pilot jettisoned his bomb load to lighten his aircraft and gained speed. 7 small fragmentation bombs, released blind, falling on whatever lay beneath. What lay beneath was the surgical section of the 95th Evacuation Hospital, marked, like every tent on the site, with a large cloth Red Cross laid out for exactly this reason. The bombs landed almost on top of it. When the smoke cleared, 28 people were dead, and roughly 60 more were wounded. Patients on the operating tables, the surgeons and nurses working over them, and staff in the surrounding wards. Among the dead were 3 members of the Army Nurse Corps: First Lieutenant Blanche Sigmund, the hospital's chief nurse, her assistant, Carrie Sheets, and Second Lieutenant Marjorie Morrow, who that same morning had opened her first letter from home in a month. An American Red Cross worker was also killed in the blast. The first woman, serving with the Red Cross, to die from enemy action in the entire war. The 95th Evacuation Hospital was wrecked. So many of its surgeons, nurses, and senior staff were among the casualties that 5th Army's Medical Command judged the unit no longer fit to operate. Within days, it was pulled off the beachhead and replaced by the 15th Evacuation Hospital, fresh from the fighting at Casino. But in the chaos, in the minutes after the blast, it was the survivors who held the wards together. One nurse in particular stood out, a woman that correspondents had quietly worried, only the day before, was too shaken by the constant shelling to carry on much longer. After the bombing, she was the one who calmly took charge, rallying the surviving nurses and corpsmen, and directing the treatment of the wounded until help arrived. Word of the bombing reached newspapers in the United States within days. The deaths of American military nurses on an active battlefield were still rare enough this early in the war to make front-page news. For the Red Cross worker killed alongside Sigmund, Sheets, and Morrow, the distinction was a grim first. In nearly 2.5 years of American involvement in the war, no woman serving with the Red Cross had yet been killed by enemy action. After February 7, 1944, that was no longer true, and February 7 did not end the reckoning. 3 days later, on February 10, German long-range artillery found the 33rd Field Hospital, killing 2 off-duty nurses, one of them killed after simply walking next door to borrow a book from the other. That same day, at the 56th Evacuation Hospital, a shell tore into the wards during another bombardment. Second Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth, 24 years old, a farm girl from Glenwood City, Wisconsin, who had joined the Army Nurse Corps less than 2 years earlier, helped move 42 patients onto the ground to shield them from further blasts before she was struck by shrapnel herself. She died 6 days later, on February 16. For their actions that day, Ainsworth and 3 fellow nurses became the first women in the history of the United States Army to be awarded the Silver Star, the Army's 3rd highest award for valor. Ainsworth's was posthumous. Decades later, her portrait would hang in the Pentagon, and her hometown post office would be renamed in her honor. Less than a week after the bombing of the 95th, the Germans launched the heaviest counterattack of the entire campaign, driving for the sea, in an effort to split the beachhead in 2 before the Allies could be reinforced. For several days in the middle of February, German tanks came closer to the beaches at Anzio than enemy armor would come at any other point in the Italian campaign. Close enough that the crews in the tents at Nettuno could hear the fighting directly, while still treating the wounded. The bombing of February 7 had already left them short-staffed to handle, but the story of February 7 still had one more turn, the one the survivors of the 95th never forgot. Hours after the bombing, the same Spitfire that had forced the German pilot off course finally caught him. He was shot down and bailed out over the beachhead, wounded, and he was brought in as a patient. To the same stretch of hospital ground, his own jettisoned bombs had torn apart that afternoon. The surgeons and nurses who had spent the day pulling their own dead from the wreckage now had a new patient on a litter in front of them. The man whose bombs, however unintentionally, had killed their chief nurse, her assistant, and a young lieutenant who that very morning had finally heard from home. There is no record of what was said in that tent, and none is needed. What is recorded is what was done. He was treated by the same hands under the same Red Cross, with the same care given to everyone else carried through that canvas flap. The pilot, by some accounts barely 18 years old, became, for those few hours, the most unusual patient the surviving staff of the 95th would ever treat. In the decades since, survivors of that hospital have returned to the moment again and again in their own accounts of the war, the same Red Cross that had failed to protect their wards that afternoon, now sheltering the very man whose bombs had fallen on them, while the nurses who had spent the day pulling their friends. The wreckage dressed his wounds without a word of reproach. That is the part of Anzio's story that casualty lists alone can't capture. The Red Cross on a tent roof was supposed to be a promise that, here at least, the war would stop. At Anzio, that promise was broken from the air on February 7th, and from the artillery on the ridges on February 10, and on other days across the 4 months that followed, while more than 4,000 American and British soldiers died fighting to hold, and then break out of the beachhead. By the time the Allies finally pushed out toward Rome in late May, the hospitals at Nettuno had treated something like 33,000 patients, nearly 11,000 of them wounded in battle. 6 members of the Army Nurse Corps had been killed at Anzio alone. Across the entire war, only 16 of the Army Nurse Corps' 201 deaths were the direct result of enemy action, which means more than a third of those 16 losses happened on this one stretch of beach, in this one campaign. And yet inside those tents, on the worst days the beachhead had to offer, the people who wore that Red Cross kept its promise anyway, for their own wounded and, when the moment came, for the wounded of the men who had bombed them. 200 Army nurses had gone to Anzio not expecting to be on the front line. They found there was no longer any line at all, and they stayed. The work they did there, under fire, in the mud, in the slit trenches, and the surgical tents alike, helped earn more than 1,600 Army nurses decorations for bravery before the war was over, and gave the United States Army its first women ever to wear the Silver Star. None of them set out to make history that morning. They set out to do rounds, to change dressings, to read letters that had taken a month to arrive. The history came later, written by the men who studied the campaign and by the families who, decades on, would still visit the American military cemetery at Nettuno, where Marjorie Morrow is buried among thousands of the soldiers whose wounds nurses like her had spent the war trying to close. For the women who lived through it, February 7, 1944, began the way every other day at Anzio began, and ended as a reminder of exactly how little that meant.